All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining our session. Today, we're going to talk about an ambitious state program from the State House to the schoolhouse. Phoebe Gohs from the Michigan Department of Education is here. She's going to describe the iterations of the program and how it's developed and learned over time. We're also joined by Sara Belvedere and Jenny Spohn, who are going to be talking to us about what performance assessment looks like in the CBE context. At their individual site levels. And then Ed is going to be providing some conceptual background on performance assessment. So we're going to start with Phoebe, we're going to move to Sara and Jenny, and then Edward's going to go talking about performance assessment, back to Jenny and to Sara. They're going to talk about the development of performance assessments and the administration of the performance assessments. And then we're going to end with a little bit of lessons learned and next steps before we get to the questions and answer session of our session. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Phoebe Gohs, and she's going to lead us through the MyPack program, as we've come to call it.
Well, hello, everybody, and thanks for joining us. My role here, my role at the department, I work in the assessment office. And I work on the administration and reporting of our statewide summative assessment, which in Michigan is the MSTEP. And my role here is I work with Michigan Assessment Consortium on MyPack. And so what I'm going to do today is just give you a background about how we got to where we are today, and what our journey has been into competency-based education and student-centered learning in Michigan up until this point. And then we have a couple of practitioners who are going to share their experience going through that process. So first, when we started this journey in about 2017, we had this vision from the state agency perspective that we wanted to provide resources to districts that would help support their implementation of competency-based education or another student-centered learning educational program. And so when we sat down and started visioning what this might look like, we really were thinking, I think everybody says they're a local control state, and Michigan is also a local control state. So instead of giving them templates that they would just take and use exactly the way that was, we've really focused on developing models for districts to take as a starting point. And if it works for their context, just to take those models and implement them. But if it doesn't, or they have something unique going on, then they could have a model for a place to start with these resources that we provided. So when we were thinking about what resources would be helpful from a district level implementation of competency-based education, we started with the profile of a graduate work. So we have a Michigan model profile of a graduate that we'll share with you in a couple minutes. And then we worked in some of our partnerships with Great Schools Partnership, we worked to develop an implementation rubric. And that was thinking about what it would look like for a district leader who's interested in implementing CBE when they have or have not, and the different components involved in implementing CBE. And then we developed the model competencies. I have essential skills in parentheses because when we were coming out of the pandemic and we were looking at how to accelerate learning, those model competencies in ELA and math that we had developed really became the essential skills that we were looking at for how to accelerate learning. And then the model performance assessments, which really is our topic for today. And it's really important, and it's not possible to overemphasize the importance of developing these partnerships as we do this work. At the state agency, we have a team of about 4 people who are doing the work here. And so it's really important that we navigate with these partnerships and leverage people and the opportunities that are out there. So we worked with Great Schools Partnership. We're currently working with the Michigan Assessment Consortium. I was really excited, and it was super helpful to work with Michigan State University because they were doing a CBE study to help us understand what CBE implementation looked like in Michigan. The first year of MyPack, we worked with the Center for Assessment, and that really came out of the work that we did with Michigan State. And then the Future of Learning Council is a Michigan group that is working to advance student-centered learning, and in particular CBE in Michigan. So that's comprised of district leaders and other education leaders who are thinking about CBE in Michigan. So at the beginning, why did we want to think about CBE? There are a lot of different and very good reasons that a district might be interested in implementing CBE. But in Michigan, we sat down and we thought, what are the things that we really want to accomplish by doing this? Why are we stepping into doing this work? And this isn't an ordered list. This is just a list of what we were thinking about for why we wanted to do CBE. So first, of course, student voice and choice in their learning. Me coming from the assessment office, the second piece on this list is I think, particularly important for me and my work, and that's meaningful and empowering assessment. I think empowering is the important word there, so that students can be involved in their learning and they can understand what they've learned and where they're going with their learning. Then, of course, progress based on mastery, not seat time, equitable access to education, and then, of course, rigorous, transparent, measurable, and transferable competencies. So the CBE work aligns with Michigan's strategic plan. We have these guiding principles, and this is really to show how this work aligns to all the rest of the work that we're doing at MDE. The first one here, it talks about all students having access to high quality instruction, no matter who they are. Everyone gets access to high quality instruction because that's what CBE does. CBE is a way that we can encourage students to express creativity, have voice in their own learning, and then also have authentic and meaningful relationships with educators, where they're building those relationships based on their academic work and stepping alongside the teachers. The teachers are stepping alongside the students to walk through their educational journey with them. And then, of course, all students provided an opportunity to achieve their dreams. So in 2017, when we stepped into working on CBE in Michigan, we really needed to think about what it was that we meant, so that not only, within the department, we had a common understanding of what we were talking about when we talked about CBE, but that we could also communicate with that with the districts that we were working with, and also as we were developing these partnerships. And we found that the best way for us to think about defining CBE really was in identifying what the components of a system of CBE were comprised of. And so here I've highlighted the keywords in each of these components. There's more detail included on the slide, but really it's about empowering students. It's about making assessment meaningful and involving students in that process, in the assessment process, and involving students in knowing what their learning is, what they're going to learn next, and how they're going to accomplish that. It's about individualizing learning. Again, progress based on mastery. There are, and I really like this next piece, different pathways and varied pacing. So students have different ways that they can achieve their goals within the CBE system. Equitable access to education, and then finally, those common expectations that are explicit and transparent and measurable for students. Some of the work that we've done, in addition to providing these resources, was incentivizing districts to engage in CBE. So in 2017, we had a state grant of $500,000. So that was Section 21J. So we called them the 21J districts. And they got some money to help support their initial implementation of CBE in their district. So there were 7 21J districts, and that represented a little over 11,000 students across the state. It was a 3-year program, and we met regularly with the 21J district leadership to develop a network of support and to do some professional development, and just to talk about what our experiences were as we did that work. And that, from that core group, a lot of other things grew out of that, because we have some 21J districts who helped us with developing our model competencies. And then also we have 21J districts who are doing some work in MyPAC, and 21J districts who are involved in the Future of Learning Council. And so that work really was the beginning and the foundation, but it's been expanded since then. And during those 3 years, was when we developed the model profile of a graduate with those districts, started that network, and then, as I mentioned, continued through FLC. And then in 2018, we had the Marshall Plan for Talent, which was a much bigger program that went far beyond just competency-based education. But one of the key objectives that you could apply for the Marshall Plan was to evolve competency-based learning in the state of Michigan. And so that was another state incentive that was provided for districts. This is our model profile of a graduate that's available to districts. One thing I really highlighted here is that the social emotional learning is in the center of our profile of a graduate, because we were at CCSSO last week, and I had an opportunity to talk with some other colleagues from MDE about how social emotional learning impacts communicating and collaborating and arguing and reasoning and the solving problems, really. And we talked about how those are fundamental to engage in those competencies, and also those competencies build social and emotional learning. So it's a really interactive process there. Yeah, and you can read through the rest of that, yeah. So before we started with working on performance assessments, of course, we started with developing model competencies. At this point, we developed those for ELA and mathematics. We have plans in the future for science and social studies, but right now, when we talk about the Michigan model competencies, we're talking about ELA and math. So we started that work with Great Schools Partnership, and they really helped us working with a team of Michigan educators. It was a big paradigm shift for everyone who was involved, the educators who were involved, the staff at MDE, and just kind of rethinking what the standards look like and what it looks like to be a student in a grade working toward a competency, as opposed to, what we've become so familiar with over time, which is the standards. So that work occurred during the 2019-2020 school year in their K-12 math and English language arts. And we do have some ongoing conversations about that, especially with the math. That one math was a challenge for us to accomplish, and I think that bred some very deep conversations about what learning looks like in math, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And so some of the educators who were involved in developing the model competencies in that partnership have continued into the work with MyPac, and I know Jenny and Sara are here. They were involved in both of those, the model competencies and MyPac. When we were working with Great Schools Partnership, this was a tool that helped us think about that paradigm shift. And this is really, this is the Michigan version of this, but this document in this triangle, I think is available in a lot of different places, because it's a really good way to think about standards being the largest chunk of the triangle at the bottom, and then moving, up into competencies at the top of that chunk. And it really also for assessment helps us to think about what does assessment look like when we're assessing a competency, or what does assessment look like when we're assessing performance indicators, and then also what does the communication of that progress look like. And so this tool really helped us set up a different paradigm for how curriculum instruction and assessment can go together in a CBE system. So these are the Michigan model competencies. You can see here on this screen, we have grades K2, it's ELA, and we're looking at reading literature, which is one of those. And so I mentioned earlier, but when we had the disrupted learning during the pandemic, we just pivoted these straight into the accelerated learning resources, which we called Michigan's Essential Skills, because this was a resource that was already available and makes perfect sense. And also because of that, I think that a lot more districts have had access to and looked at them as a result of that work. And I provided a link on this slide so that you can go and see these resources. They're available K-12, ELA, and math. This is the MSU study that they accomplished. They did surveys. And they had some really helpful findings for us as we went through that work. And the biggest takeaway that I had from that study that they did was that professional development is a very important area of need for CBE districts. all around, so leadership and teachers who are implementing to help support them in that implementation. Most of our districts had a unique profile of a graduate, so they may or may not have started with the Michigan model profile, but they took that and made it their own, 90%. Interestingly, with that next bullet point for they had measurable competencies, 80% said yes. The survey was done before we developed our model competencies. So districts have been deep in this work even before we caught up with them. And then the last piece is the last one that I'll highlight. There's some other stuff on the slide, but I'm running a little long. The last piece is student agency was not as prevalent as we had anticipated. Only half of students indicated that it was true that teachers consider students' interests when deciding on what they work on. And only 20% report being able to choose topics of study. And that was really reflected in some of the qualitative responses we got from interviews conducted with teachers. And I think it goes into the need for professional development because, middle and high school teachers, they say, I have, 6 classes of 30 students a day, and I'm supposed to have everybody at a different place doing a different thing. And I just don't know what that looks like or how to manage something that looks like that. And so I think that was really what drives that one half of students indicating that they had choice in what they were working on. And I think it was an opportunity for us to think a little more deeply about how we can support the instructional shift in CBE districts. This was another thing that came out of our work with MSU. Again, this was a really helpful way, going through this theory of change process was a helpful way to make visual and concrete what we were thinking about when we were thinking about competency-based education. And so we have these components at the top. Those are in the white boxes. Talking about your profile of a graduate, your competencies, personalized instruction, student agency, PBL, and competency-based credentialing. And of course, we're not there with everything, but this is an aspirational statement. And then we have these proximal and distal outcomes listed. So, and we listed them for how an educator looks, and then also what happens for students. And also ultimately our goals are more efficient and effective teacher workforce, and also increased student intrinsic motivation. And these are the steps that you take to get there. So shifting practice for educators and increasing developmentally appropriate instruction. And then for students, it's about increasing autonomy, competency, and student sense of relatedness. So we've got the competencies, we've done that study, we've incentivized our districts. And so now it's time for us to look at, if we're providing these model competencies for districts, how can we support them by providing some assessments that are aligned to this instructional shift that we're trying to encourage from the state agency. And so that's what MyPAC really is doing. Everything the assessment offices, we always are trying to develop local assessment literacy, and that is also true for MyPAC. Also, we want to create a library of performance assessments that schools and districts can use who are implementing the competencies, because we know that that is a longer process that really takes a lot of time and thinking. So this would be a way to support educators who are implementing those to have a resource that they can use. Always, we want to promote appropriate use of performance assessment and any kind of assessment within a balanced assessment system, and then support district implementation of CBE or other student-centered programs. We are currently in our 3rd year of MyPAC. Cohort 1 was the pandemic year, so that was the year where everything, after everything, it was the year where everything was fully pandemic. So 2020, 2021, we initially had planned for that to be in person. It was not. We had 8 participants and we had 9 model performance assessments. And we did that work with Center for Assessment because it was part of the MSU study. That's when the MAC came in for cohort 2. We had more participants, we developed more performance assessments, and then we also got to field testing some of them, doing some rubric calibration, and doing some scoring in MyCSS, which is an online collaborative scoring tool. This is where we are. I'm super excited. Our waiting list is short, but we have one. So I'm excited. We continue to have more and more people who are interested in doing the work. Our goal is to have 50 model performance assessments available by the end of this year. We're also going to do field tests and rubric calibration, and also using the online collaborative scoring system. Our long-range goals, we want to develop a library of performance assessments that people can pick and use for what we have available for competencies right now, K-12, ELA, and math. We want to use that collaborative scoring system. We haven't had a chance yet to dip our toes deeply into that work, just because we have to have more performance assessments available before we can really get into that. But we're excited to be able to use that in the long term. Support the instructional shift for educators, especially, you know, with that being an outcome of what we learned through the MSU CBE study. We need to think about how we can help support our educators with that. And then eventually we'd like to develop model competencies for science and social studies, and then align performance assessments to that work. So MyPack, these are the resources that MyPack provides. The model performance assessments, the rubrics that go along with it, student work samples to help you understand what, different rubric scores look like, and then the online collaborative scoring tool. These are links of resources that are available for Michigan Educator. You can, of course, anybody can access them. They're available on the website. The what and why of CBE, that's really our definitional document that I kind of picked some through earlier on a slide. That profile of a graduate that I shared with you, there's a PDF of that that's available at that link. You can also look at the model competencies in ELA and math. And then, of course, coming soon will be our model performance assessments.
Okay, thank you, Phoebe. That was that's always a good, even for me to hear it and all distilled in one place is a great joy, because I know that a lot of work has gone into that. Next, we're going to hear from Jenny Spohn and Sara Belvedere about the competency development, and particularly what that looked like from their point of view. And I think Jenny's going to start us off. So whenever you're ready, please.
Thank you, John. Thank you. So I joined the team about 7 years ago. While working for Tecumseh Public Schools, we really were able to identify a need for a shift in our education. And that led us to creating some thematic units that had problem-based cross-curricular plans that we created. And I worked with a team of teachers, about 10 of us, trying to create some more meaningful educational experiences for our students. During the year, I was really supported by my fellow teachers and administrators. And we tried a lot of different approaches, but I was really struggling that year with trying to figure out how math truly fit into these thematic units to be as good as social studies and English and our science people as part of our team. Later on in the spring, I ended up going to a professional development at the county level, and I was sharing some of my experiences and ended up meeting someone from the Michigan Department of Education. And was surprised to learn that there was a team started to work on some of the math standards to rewrite them into competencies. The first meeting that I went to in Lansing, I was just blown away by the number of people that were trying to do some of the same work. I was really excited to join, I don't know, just all the like-minded people. We ended up meeting monthly. It would be full day meetings, and I'd work with people around the state on creating big ideas that we were going to focus all of our competencies around. During our meetings, we had a lot of professional development about what competency-based education meant and how we could create competencies or standards so that we would have a little bit more freedom to teach in a way that is meaningful for all students. Thank you. So we began by working on our big ideas. And as Phoebe mentioned, we had the Great School Partnership that helped facilitate our meetings. They guided us with norms and really guided us through some of those infographics that Phoebe shared just a little bit earlier. And it helped us create one common goal. We focused so many months on trying to create our big ideas. And I would say probably even the greater part of a year, if not just a little bit over. And in our big group, we struggled to decide whether we wanted our math standards to, or excuse me, our math competencies and our big ideas to incorporate some of the mathematical practices. And ultimately, we ended up creating about 5 big ideas, and Phoebe showed the one slide with some of the ELA standards on it, and our math one looked similar to that. Our overarching big ideas, beyond being the most difficult part, it became just a task that lots of people had a very passionate objective in, and really trying to decide what was best for the state of Michigan. We ended up breaking into some smaller groups so that we could make sure all voices were heard, and we'd get back together. And ultimately, we created our big ideas. We had 5 of them, and then we started the work on our competencies. We were working in those monthly meetings up through about March of 2020, I believe, right before everything shut down. And we used our Michigan standards to be able to create those big ideas off of, and then later on to work with our competencies. Great Schools Partnership helped us decide that we needed to stick with around 5 to 8 competencies per big idea. And that gave us a really good starting point to say, don't go too deep into our grain size, which is what we referred to as how deep the competency went into detail about what we were going to require students to do. When we were writing our mathematics competencies, we really wanted to focus on making sure that it was easily understood by anybody that was going to read them, whether it was students or teachers or parents. And as we used those Michigan state standards, we didn't want to focus in too much on our language that we were using, but to make sure that we kept only essential things in those competencies. Some big takeaways that I have from this process is working on the common language and getting the big ideas nailed down before we went into writing some of the finer points of the competencies. Having the third-party facilitators definitely helped us to stay focused. We were able to take care of any discrepancies or disputes between how things should have been worded, or whether or not we wanted our mathematical practices to stand alone or within our large group of our big ideas. And really just that third party helped us a lot with our large group going into small groups and then going back into large groups so that we could reach consensus. And then I believe Sarah's going to share some of hers experiences.
Thanks, Jenny. So I started this work as part of Fraser High School, Fraser Public Schools, who was part of the 21J grant through this MDE, and I represented the English portion of it. So I was a secondary English teacher at the time, and we were tasked, along like Jenny was, of creating statewide competencies and big ideas for secondary English. And it was a difficult starting point when you get a lot of like-minded people together. As I'm sure all of you know, teachers are very passionate people, and they really love their content and they want everything included at all times. English teachers want everyone to know what similes and metaphors are, and you need to be able to identify them and describe them and explain why they're being used. So really it took a big step back for us to kind of like look back and think, what are our big goals? What do we want our students to be able to do when they leave our class at the end of the semester, at the end of the year? And then also scaffold that up. English, you do the same thing every year. You're reading, you're writing, you're speaking, you're doing some research, you're learning some grammar. So for us, it was really important to differentiate what all of that looked like at different levels, because our competencies and our big ideas are recursive. They happen every year, 6-12. So we spent a lot of time differentiating what all of that looked like at a different level, especially when you get to high school. So there's a difference between an argumentative essay in 9th grade versus 10th grade versus 11th versus 12th. So for us, it was a lot of time was spent in kind of like scaffolding that up so everyone would know what it looked like. And we had, a wish list of what would be really nice if our students were able to do and to master versus like a must list. So there were a lot of arguments surrounding some of like the minute details of the English curriculum. Grammar topics, grammar was a big bone of contention for a lot of people. But for me, the big idea was just thinking broadly, thinking, what is best for our students at the end of the year? What should they be able to do at the end of each semester and course? So for that kind of gives you guys a big sense of, Michigan's journey in competency-based education. I'm going to pass it over to Ed, who's going to give you a history of performance assessments and the MAC's role in all of that.
Thanks, Sara. I'll spare you the history of performance assessment, because actually assessment up until about 100 years ago was performance assessment. Multiple choice items hadn't been invented yet. But I think that one of the things that can really kind of bring home the idea of competency-based assessment versus just content assessment is the use of performance assessment. And so I want to talk a little bit about what it is and why it's important. Next slide. Well, I noted this in an ASCD publication, and I wanted to share this. Our students, our adults gain content knowledge, acquire skills, and develop work habits. But it's the practice of those and the application of those to real world situations that really helps us to determine if they've got it or not. Being able to memorize something for a test on Friday, doing well on it, and then forgetting it and moving on is not really what we're talking about. We're talking about things that students learn and are learned to do, and engage in a meaningful activity that allows us to determine if they can really use those, and ideally in situations that would be analogous to real life. At least I would assert that perhaps school life isn't real life, but our goal is to help our students be prepared for life after high school, whether they're going on to education and job training, right into a job, or perhaps a homemaker. But whatever it is, whatever their life roles, to be prepared for that, and assessment plays a role in that, because it is a way to engage students. Next slide. I think the reason for that is because performance assessment really measures how well students can apply their knowledge, skills, and abilities to something that's authentic. And I've noted years ago in a presentation at a national conference that sometimes authentic, what it means to an adult, is not exactly what it means to a student. And I remember years ago, my son was involved in the interactive math program, and he came home and he said, I just got this stupid assignment about figuring out critical path analysis. I said, oh, wow, that is a really important concept, something that I use on the job. I was state assessment director at the time, and we were tasked with creating test booklets and answer sheets and all the ancillary materials, and all of them had to be printed and by different printers, assembled in one spot, picked and packed, and then shipped to schools for the annual state testing. And I said, wow, this is really important, Matthew. This is something you'll really use in real life. They said, Dad, I don't have a real life. And so authenticity is sometimes, we developed assessments of student teamwork. And we based it on a model that we saw in an industrial plant in Michigan that they used during the hiring process. We used their scoring guide, but having kids determine how to build a car is probably not something within their knowledge base. So we had them plan a party for the junior class in the high school, something that they might engage in, and then use that rubric from the workplace in evaluating how well they work together. So that we can create authentic-like situations for students, but that are analogous to what they might face in life after school, on the job, in college, etc. But that's certainly much better than something that's just a cut and dried problem without any context to it. And one of the nice things about performance assessments is that typically students produce something. And it's not just a test question answer. It's something like a report. It could be a written report. It could be a brochure. It could be a product. It could be an experiment that they've carried out and written up. It could be something that they perform. It could be a theatrical performance or a dance that they've created, a musical composition that they've made, a science investigation that they've carried out and written up. So that, to me, that these are really important concepts. And of course, then the duration is going to be more than just a few minutes in a class period. And that's one of the things I think that teachers struggle with is how can I give these lengthy activities to students and still manage a class. And of course, in an individualized learning environment where students are moving at their own pace, a teacher might have multiple performance assessments active, if you will, among the several students in a class. But I've got some ideas about that. Next slide. These, again, repeating some of what I've covered before, they're engaging, they're active, they're relevant. Kids, it really probes the breadth and depth of a learning target, rather than to take something that really would require an open response or even a performance assessment and create a little piece of it in a multiple choice item. The performance assessment really kind of opens that up so that students have to produce something. They have to do something. And that tends to be the mode of assessment most like the nature of the target, the competency or standard. And they really require students to think deeply and then transfer their learning. Why? Because these aren't simply recall. They're creating something that has never been created before. They're looking at in our case in Michigan, they're looking at the assets of Michigan communities and thinking about where would a company like X best site a plant. So they would have to go in, they'd have to search databases from our Department of Commerce, they'd have to look at what are the characteristics of various communities, where might there be the natural resources necessary, for example, plentiful electricity, fresh water, whatever that plant would require, and think about then making a case for a particular site and then either writing about it or making a presentation like they were going to make a presentation to the board of directors of that company. This site in Michigan would be ideal for your plant, etc. They're fair and unbiased. And I think the reason, there's nothing inherent about assessment that's fair and unbiased, but I think that about a performance assessment, when students get to pick the topic for it and the manner in which they address it, they're really able to access their own funds of knowledge, their own background, and understand something and express it in ways that they can handle. So rather than put them in a situation that may disadvantage students can take the situation and create something that works for them. And I think, one of the things that I think is important is that there really have to be clear performance criteria. We have to know how these are going to be assessed, and so and that's something that I've emphasized in our work. Next slide. I think that another thing that's we try to do in our performance assessments is to write them out in a standardized way, as if rather than giving the teacher 2 paragraphs of a task and say go forth and do it, we have a very specific format that our performance assessments take. And maybe it comes from too many years of working in assessment, but we start off by noting what are the model competencies and big ideas that'll be assessed. We provide a brief description of the assessment, which allows the teacher to quickly gauge if this is something they want to use, and if so, when, during the school year. We describe the number of parts of the session and how long it takes, the materials that are needed. We provide a script, which of material to be read to student and directions of teachers. That's unusual for most assessments that teachers give, but it assures that we can give the assessment in a comparable way across the state or across the nation for that matter. And then there's scoring rubrics that students see in advance of their work on the item so that they know how we're going to measure them. And then there are worksheets that they'll use to carry out the activities, in some cases producing a product that's separate from the student booklet. So those are some of the ways that we standardize the assessment, but also giving teachers the opportunity to customize it for their setting and for their classroom. In other words, sometimes the subject of the task can be changed to fit the instructional patterns of the teacher. Well, these are some of the reasons for using performance assessment, and I've already touched on several of these. To me, that they really ought to be a critical part of a learner-centered educational environment. And one of the things that I find really discouraging is programs in which students learn at their own pace, and when they're ready to be assessed, we give them a multiple choice test to quickly determine if they've learned enough to move on to the next unit. And I'm a firm believer that the nature of the assessment affects the nature of instruction and learning. So a multiple choice test begets drill sheets and memorization. Whereas performance assessments and written response assessments really engage students in thinking and doing, and they're memorable. They stay with students forever. You know, I saw that again with my son and some of the stuff that he's done, and he's now in his 40s, and he still talks about some of the assessments that he had in high school. And you know, I think that by giving students more control over the topic and such, then students are actually more engaged in it, and I think that really serves to motivate them. And there's always a question whether tests that are multiple choice really are taken seriously by students. Whereas these, I think they can be, because students can put themselves into the item. You know, I think that there are different types of performance assessment, and I'll touch on that in a second to give some examples. But some are short and can be included in a check for understanding during a class period, and others that are lengthier. The performance tasks could be used in combination to measure progress within units and across units. And I've seen some schools that use a performance task is assigned every 4 to 6 weeks throughout the school year, and students assemble the evidence of their proficiency via portfolio at the end of that. And so, you know, to me, it is a very useful adjunct to competency education. And in some cases, we even go so far as to require senior projects for graduation, and there are states that do that. One that I worked with was Rhode Island, and they have a senior project required for their certificate of advanced mastery. And I think that you know, to me, the best part of it, I think, is that standards-based education and performance assessments is one of the best ways to assess difficult to measure skills that are actually the ones that we really care about the most, like critical thinking, collaboration, or effective communication. Next slide. And I've touched on the two different kinds. I kind of divide the world, and other people would probably reverse these, but events, a performance event is an on-demand assessment in which students provide a first draft without benefit of rehearsal, practice, or revision. These typically last a part of a class period or maybe 2 class periods. But for example, in music, a student who sight reads, a student who completes an activity and doesn't get a chance to revise it. I've had people say, well, that's not really realistic. And I cite the example of one noon. I was sitting in my office, and the state superintendent came in and said, in 45 minutes, I'm meeting with a such and such. Can you write me a paper on X? And I did. It was about 1.5 pages. It was first draft. I mean, maybe 1.5 draft, but I didn't have any writing process. I didn't have any peers to review it. They were all out at lunch. There are times in the workplace where you have to do first draft work. That's not desirable, however, and I'm not saying I enjoyed that, but particularly when the state superintendent was going to take the piece of paper to the governor, and I figured any flack would accrue to me. Thankfully, it didn't. So, and the other that I think is really the most valuable are performance tasks, where we give students the opportunity to work on something over time, to plan, to rehearse, to review, to modify, and really polish their responses. And so, we want students to do high quality work, and we don't want to limit that by just saying everything has to be done in 30 minutes or less. So some of the performance tasks that are being created from MyPack span several days. And that's good. So how does a teacher deal with that? Well, one way is to, as I've alluded to, is to have students work on these as independent projects while teachers are engaged in a learning activity, or where students are engaged in a learning activity that may take place in school. They're also working on these projects outside of school, and they become things that are turned in at the end of that multi-week project. Here's some examples of the kind of items. Written paper could be a petition to student council, presentations, arguments and care for a proposed change to the student council, creating a product. One of my favorites in our music performance assessments is to select the name and create a label for a soda can and the theme of a famous artist. Another one, theater item, to demonstrate what life on the orphan train must have been like for young children in the 1890s. This is a real thing, by the way, and if you don't know what the orphan train is, I urge you to Google it. Solve a problem, determine the cost of refreshments for a school party. That's one of our MyPack items. And then fix something, repair a car or motorcycle where it's purposely been disabled in a fixed way, and then we determine if the student has the necessary mechanical skills and use of diagnostic tools to fix it. So, those are some of the things that I think really define performance assessments and why they're important. And now I think I'm turning over to Sara, right? Or perhaps Jenny. Sara.
Yeah, this time Sarah's going to go first, and
Yep.
we're going to talk about performance assessment development. So Sara, whenever you're ready.
Sure. Yep, I'm ready. So I started with the performance assessments back in cohort 1. So I worked with the Center for Assessment to develop my first performance assessment. And I was actually just looking at my first assessment just a couple weeks ago. And I had to double take. I don't know what I was thinking in the early planning stages. I learned along the way, again, looking at this through the English lens, I had developed a speech where my students were going to be presenting to the school board regarding a social justice topic of their choosing. And in coming up with this, I was like, well, they're going to be writing it. So I had all of these writing competencies, and then they were going to do research. I was pulling that in. And I remember I had to take a step back and really think about, what is the big idea? What am I really, truly assessing in this assessment? Again, it's easy as an English teacher to pull in any sort of writing topic, writing big ideas and competencies, because, we want to grade all of that when they're turning it in. So my biggest piece of advice is to really think about what you're actually truly assessing, and make sure that your assessment is focused around that. Thinking about the depth of knowledge, how deep do you want students to go? And thinking up to yourself, even, as you're creating the rubric, what is, the gold standard that I'm going to be using when I'm grading this? What should, exemplary assessment look like? And then go to the other end of that, and what won't be acceptable? The biggest takeaway I had during cohort 1 was I got to work with other teachers developing it. So we had a lot of sessions where we would just throw ideas out. It's kind of like throwing spaghetti at a wall and see which one would stick. And even though a lot of the ideas didn't stick, I found myself using some of those assessment ideas for formative assessments during the unit, or even as I started designing performance assessments later on, I would go back to that brainstorming from that earlier session and kind of steal ideas that had been mentioned. And let's see, thinking about how we can make this assessment accessible for all learners. So I would get to a point where I would stop and I would kind of visualize the students in my classroom or students on my roster and think about what different scaffolding techniques I would need to build in so that all of my students could be successful with the performance assessment. So whether that was my ELL students, my students with 504s, my just at-risk students, my students with IEPs, I would try to develop the assessment in a way that would make sure that all students could feel successful. And so it wouldn't be, a source of frustration for them as they were working on their own. And then again, my biggest takeaways is that, it helps to work with a team. Don't try and do this on your own. The more people that you can brainstorm with, the better. Provide as much student choice as possible. Phoebe mentioned earlier on those findings from the MSU EPIC study that, students really didn't feel like they had a say in what they were doing. So whether it's maybe a choice board or a menu, allowing them to pick something that, they feel like they can be successful with really helps them take ownership and feel pride in their work. It's important to get feedback along the way. And as scary as it can be, even after the assessment, asking the students what they thought of it, any advice that they would have moving forward to maybe revise or change things. I know anytime I'm piloting assessment, I'm reading the instructions, my students always have a dozen of questions. So I'm writing all of them down so I can go back and look to see if maybe there was something that I needed to include in the instructions or to clarify the process to help ease their fears. And I think the biggest thing is, somebody mentioned this earlier, that it really takes time. Like you can't just lock yourself in a room for a day, write a performance assessment, and then implement it the next day. It takes a lot of time, thinking, and patience as you're working through this. So that way, you can develop something that's actually meaningful and something that, like Ed's son, they'll remember when they're in their 40s and, thinking back to, that really cool thing that they had an opportunity to participate in. So I'm going to pass it over to Jenny now.
Thank you. So similar to Sara, this is, I think, my second year of working with a cohort. I know Sara was there the first year, and then I joined the second. So from my perspective, coming in and working with Ed and Phoebe, I feel like I had a lot of professional development. I continued to learn a lot through the process. And that gave me a lot of internal gratification, not only making me a better teacher, but making sure my students were really understanding what we were doing. And by working on writing performance assessments, I have felt more empowered to change even more of what I'm doing, even though I've been at this for several years. Just as Sara said, the continuous improvement and rereading and thinking about all the students and their roadblocks that they may come up against while they are being assessed has really helped change and modify in those editing processes while writing my assessments. My initial struggle was how to make everything a real world setting and make it so unique and something that the students had never seen before. And then I kind of understood and realized that in math, sometimes we just have to use a coordinate plane, and there's not a real world setting I can apply to it if I am truly just looking at a coordinate plane. And sometimes there is. Sometimes we can make it a choice board, as Sara said, and students can graph like a map of their town, and they can do lots of things with finding distances and midpoints. The biggest takeaway, though, is to make sure that no matter what type of math we're assessing, including students' choice in it and even their voice, making it applicable to them, will really enhance that assessment and the meaning as we are creating all of these new ones. It's really important. And back to, I believe, Phoebe.
Yeah, so just thinking about, to close here, thinking about the lessons learned that we've learned in the process of going through all of this work. The first is professional development is essential, and it requires time. And so that is a place, when you're stepping into this work, or if you're in the middle of doing this work, that is just a very integral piece to everything else that you do. And I think we learned that really from the MSU study. Partnerships among several organizations, it helps the SEA to build capacity, but beyond that, it also develops a whole community of stakeholders, and it's a way to invite people into doing the work with you and walking alongside you as you support the work. Of course, focusing on systems change. And then another thing that we've learned is that there are multiple entry points to the work that different districts will follow. So many districts were in the grant program, so that for us would be 21J. Many other in different districts were involved in adopting or thinking about profile of a graduate. I know most districts in Michigan now do have a profile of a graduate, although not all of them are necessarily CBE at this point. Other districts can join the work through, the essential skills. That was really a way to highlight and make sure the field was aware of the work that we're doing in CBE. And then there are other districts who have just joined us for MyPAC, and that's the first time that we've been able to engage with them. So providing different ways to join you in the work really helps to build that community. I think the last slide we go to Ed. Is that right?
Well, we're just going to take some questions and answers. So it really could be anybody. And on the screen here, you can see our contact information. Please feel free to reach out if there's any further conversations you want to have. We're thrilled to be part of this community. And this is kind of a new entry for us. So if you would like to reach out to us, we would love to hear from you. Any of the participants today, including myself. So that's how you can reach us. And let's check the chat here. And if you have a question, please do drop it in the chat. Let's see. If you have any questions, Jen asked a question about the underlying goals of CBE, and it looks like Phoebe answered that. Let's take a look. If you have any questions, please do drop them in the chat, and then we will have one of us will answer. If not, no worries. Looks like we have a request too about slide number 9. So you might want to look away for a second because I'm going to go back to slide 9. Sorry. If somebody had a question about it, I got direct messaged about. I want to make sure that we address that if possible. Oh, I see. It's a question about the graph. I can take that up offline, Jim, with you about that question. All right. Well, without seeing any avalanche of questions, please do reach out to us if you have any questions, or if you want to follow up with us in any way. We would look forward and we would welcome that kind of interaction. So again, thank you, and we hope you have a good rest of your conference.